The frontier was not a place that forgave hesitation. It rewarded only those who learned quickly, endured silently, and accepted that nature would always have the final word. For families who pushed beyond settled towns into raw, half-mapped territory, survival was not a seasonal concern. It was a daily calculation. Every sunrise carried uncertainty, and every sunset was a quiet relief that the day had been endured. This was the world into which one mother found herself, standing at the center of a household, far larger than the land seemed capable of sustaining. Their homestead sat miles from the nearest settlement, a patch of cleared earth surrounded by endless trees and open sky. The soil looked promising at first glance, dark, loamy, eager. But appearances on the frontier were often lies told by the land itself. Spring rains could vanish without warning. Frost could return weeks after planting. Pests arrived without mercy and left nothing but stripped stalks behind. There were no second chances, no government relief wagons, no surplus markets to fall back on. What the family grew, hunted, preserved, or gathered was all that stood between them and hunger. The mother rose before dawn each day long before the children stirred beneath their thin quilts. 12 of them slept in the small cabin, bodies arranged carefully to share warmth through the night. The youngest were still too small to understand the danger of an empty pantry, but the older ones knew. Hunger taught children quickly. It sharpened their senses, slowed their play, and etched worry into faces that should have known only youth. She saw it in their eyes even when they tried to hide it, an awareness that food was never guaranteed. Her husband worked the land from first light until dusk, but the frontier had already taught her a hard truth. Effort alone was not enough. Men broke their backs on soil that returned nothing. Entire families vanished between seasons, cabins left standing like gravestones without names. She had watched wagons pass their homestead heading back east. Families who had lost hope, dragging what little remained of their lives behind them. Others never left at all. They simply faded. Winter was the true enemy. Summer hunger could be endured with wild berries, roots, and whatever small game could be caught. But winter closed its fist around the land. Snow erased paths, rivers froze, the forest went silent, and the cabin, no matter how tightly chinked, always seemed to breathe cold. The children learned to sleep in layers, to move less, to speak softly, as if noise itself wasted energy. Every mouthful of food had to be justified. In the settlement several miles away, neighbors spoke in hushed tones about shortages. Failed crops were not uncommon, but whispers of repeated failure stirred real fear. Grain stores shrank, livestock died or were sold too early. Bartering became tense. People counted one another's children, quietly measuring whose household would run out first. There was no malice in it, only survival instinct. The frontier stripped kindness down to its bare essentials. This mother understood that her family size was both a blessing and a danger. 12 children meant more hands when times were good, but it also meant 12 lives depending entirely on her ability to plan beyond the present day. She could not afford optimism alone. Hope did not fill stomachs. Experience had taught her that survival required foresight, discipline, and an uncomfortable willingness to do what others would not. She had grown up hearing stories from older women, tales never written down, passed quietly from mother to daughter, stories of winters that killed entire towns, of women who learned to stretch meals beyond reason, who found nourishment where others saw waste, who understood that survival was not always about abundance, but about control. She listened more than she spoke, storing those lessons away, while others dismissed them as superstition or desperation. The cabin itself reflected this mindset. Nothing was decorative. Everything had a purpose. Jars lined the shelves, even when empty, waiting to be filled again. Scraps were saved, bones cleaned and stored, cloth reused until it fell apart entirely. The children learned early that nothing was thrown away without reason. Waste was a luxury the frontier did not allow. Outside, the land stretched vast and indifferent. Some days it offered promise, green shoots pushing through soil, birds returning, a sense that perhaps this year would be different. Other days it felt like an adversary testing the family's resolve. She watched the sky constantly, reading clouds, measuring wind, calculating risk. A storm could mean life or death, abundance or loss. Isolation pressed in from all sides. Letters arrived months late, if at all. News traveled slowly, often distorted by fear or rumor. There were no doctors nearby, no teachers, no safety net. Illness could sweep through a household unchecked. An injury could end a man's ability to work permanently. And always there was the quiet terror of running out of food. At night, when the children slept, The mother often lay awake listening to the sounds of the cabin, settling. The wind moving through the trees, the faint breathing of 12 small chests, rising and falling. Each breath was a responsibility. Each life was a calculation she carried alone. She did not speak her fears aloud. Fear, she believed, had a way of spreading. The frontier demanded a certain kind of silence from women, an expectation that they endure without complaint, that they solve problems quietly while others debated them openly. She accepted this role not as submission, but as strategy. While others argued about whether politics or fate, she observed patterns, counted stores, and prepared for the worst. She knew that if the land failed them, there would be no warning and no forgiveness. What outsiders saw was a mother managing a household. What the frontier saw was something else entirely, a strategist operating under constant pressure, making decisions that balanced risk against starvation. She was not waiting for salvation from the soil. She was preparing for its betrayal. As the season shifted and the signs of trouble began to appear, weak growth, unpredictable weather, whispers of failure spreading through neighboring homesteads, she understood that the coming winters would not be kind. And while others clung to tradition and hope, she began quietly laying the groundwork for something different, something most would call impossible. But for now, the family lived one day at a time, suspended between what had been planted and what might never grow. The frontier watched, indifferent as always, while one mother measured the future not in years or harvests, but in meals. The first year the crops failed, people still believed it was an exception. Frontier life had taught them that the land tested newcomers before rewarding them, and most families accepted a bad harvest as the price of settling somewhere new. The spring had started well enough. Seeds went into the ground on time, the soil held moisture, and the fields showed a thin promise of green. But promise on the frontier was fragile. A late frost swept through without warning, blackening tender shoots overnight. Rows that had looked alive the evening before stood limp and ruined by morning. Families replanted where they could, digging deeper into seed reserves they could not easily replace. Summer followed with cruel irony. Weeks passed without rain. The sun hardened the soil into cracked plates, and each step through the fields kicked up dust instead of hope. Corn grew stunted, barely reaching a child's knee. Wheat heads formed thin and hollow. Gardens that once offered variety, beans, squash, onions, produced just enough to tease the eye and starve the body. That winter was difficult, but manageable. Most households still had stores from previous years, and game had not yet vanished. People tightened belts, skipped meals, and told themselves next year would be better. Hunger crept in quietly, like cold through poorly sealed walls, but it had not yet settled fully into their bones. The second year stripped away optimism. Spring returned late and confused, swinging wildly between warmth and sudden cold. Seeds germinated unevenly. Some fields sprouted, others remained bare, as if the earth itself had decided which families deserved to eat. Then came the insects. Grasshoppers arrived in waves, moving across the land like a living storm. They stripped leaves down to stems, chewed through what frost had spared, and left behind fields that looked burned rather than eaten. Men walked their land in silence, hats pulled low, boots heavy with more than mud. They had seen bad years before, but this felt different. There was no single cause to blame, no one storm, no one mistake. The failure was total and humiliating. Effort meant nothing. Experience meant nothing. The land did not negotiate. By midsummer the signs were impossible to ignore. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys at regular hours because there was little reason to cook. Children grew quieter, their movements slower. Even laughter sounded cautious, as if joy itself might cost something they could not afford. Livestock were slaughtered early, not for celebration but necessity. Families argued over whether to save animals for breeding or turn them into meals before winter claimed them anyway. Bartering grew desperate. A sack of grain might cost a tool, a blanket, or a promise of labor that might never be fulfilled. Trust eroded under hunger's pressure. Some neighbors helped one another, sharing what little they had left. Others hoarded, locking cellars and watching visitors with suspicion. No one judged. Hunger rewrote morality. The mother watched all of this with a tightening in her chest. She counted their stores again and again, hoping she had miscalculated. She had not. What they had might carry them through one hard winter, but not another. And the land showed no sign of mercy. The third growing season arrived not with fear but dread. By then the settlement had changed. Cabins stood empty, doors hanging open, belongings left behind by families who fled under cover of night rather than face another season of slow starvation. Graves appeared on the edges of properties, marked with rough boards and no words. Illness followed hunger closely, taking the young and the old first. There was no strength left to bury the dead properly. Spring rains came heavy and unrelenting, washing away seed before it could root. Fields turned to mud, then to swamp. When the rains finally stopped, the heat arrived all at once, baking the ground into something unusable. What little survived early flooding was scorched. Mold crept into root cellars. Stored grain spoiled. The failure was complete. By midsummer, it was no longer a question of tightening rations. It was a question of survival, measured in weeks. Mothers learned to quiet crying children by sending them to sleep early. Fathers left before dawn to hunt farther and farther from home, returning empty-handed more often than not. The forest had been overhunted. Rivers were crowded with desperate lions and fewer fish each day. The children understood more than adults wanted to admit. They stopped asking for seconds. They learned to chew slowly, to savor flavor as if it might not return. The older ones watched their younger siblings closely, alert to weakness, to the subtle signs that hunger had crossed from discomfort into danger. Childhood ended early in those years. For the mother, the pressure became constant and physical. Hunger was no longer just something she feared, it was something she managed. Every decision carried weight. Feed the children more today and risk tomorrow, or ration tightly and watch energy drain from their bodies. Waste became unforgivable. Even mistakes that cost a single meal felt catastrophic. Neighbors began to talk openly about leaving, though few had the strength or supplies to make the journey. Others spoke of waiting it out, convinced that endurance alone would save them. But endurance without strategy was killing families quietly, one by one. The mother noticed something else too, patterns in who survived longest. It was not always the strongest men or the largest farms. It was the households where women controlled food strictly, where meals were planned days ahead, where nothing edible was ignored. It was the families who adapted rather than hoped. As winter approached for the third time, fear turned sharp and immediate. There were no reserves left to fall back on. The margin for error was gone. One storm, one illness, one misjudgment could end everything. The land had failed them 3 years in a row, and there was no guarantee it would not fail again. At night, as wind rattled the cabin walls and the children slept, the mother listened and calculated. She thought not in seasons anymore, but in days. She understood that whatever had worked before would not work now. Tradition had failed. Faith alone had failed. Waiting had failed. The crops were gone. The safety net was gone. And winter was coming again. It was in that space, between certainty and catastrophe, that desperation transformed into resolve. Where others saw only loss, she began to see necessity. The third failure did not break her. It forced her to abandon every assumption about food. Survival, endure was considered acceptable. The land had taken everything it could. What remained was ingenuity, or nothing at all. By the time the idea took shape in her mind, it no longer felt like an idea at all. It felt like something she had always known but never dared to name. Desperation has a way of stripping away embarrassment, tradition, and fear of judgment, leaving only the question that matters: what works? For weeks she had watched neighbors cling to methods that no longer served them, repeating the same rituals because they were familiar, because abandoning them felt like admitting failure. She understood that impulse. But she also understood something else. Familiarity would not feed 12 children through another winter. The trick, as others would later call it, did not arrive suddenly. It grew out of fragments, half-remembered stories from older women, observations she had made quietly over years, and lessons learned from scarcity itself. It was not heroic. It was not dramatic. And that was precisely why no one believed in it. On the frontier, there were strict, unspoken rules about what was considered food. People spoke proudly of hunting, of harvests, of full cellars. There was shame attached to anything that suggested desperation. Certain things were labeled famine food, mentioned only in whispers, associated with death marches and failed settlements. To admit you relied on them was to admit you were losing. She decided she would lose nothing. The first part of the trick was seeing value where others saw nothing. When livestock was slaughtered early, neighbors discarded parts they did not know how to use or did not consider worth the effort. Bones were thrown, and aside once the obvious meat was stripped away. Fat was wasted if it did not render cleanly. Skins were burned or buried. She watched this quietly, filing it away. Hunger had taught her that nourishment did not announce itself. It hid in overlooked places. The second part was control, not just rationing, but timing. She understood that hunger was not only about calories. It was about predictability. Children who did not know when they would eat grew weaker faster. Fear burned energy the body could not afford to lose. Her plan required discipline so strict it bordered on cruelty. and she knew others would judge her for it. When she began, she told no one outside the household. Even her husband was given only pieces of the truth, not because she did not trust him, but because doubt was contagious. If people believed something was foolish or dangerous, their fear would seep into her resolve. She could not allow that. She started by changing the rhythm of the household. Meals were no longer tied to daylight hours or tradition. They were tied to conservation. Portions were smaller, but they were consistent. No one was allowed to eat early out of hunger or late out of habit. The children protested at first, then adapted. Predictability calmed them in ways she had hoped but not expected. Then she began introducing foods that would have horrified her neighbors. Roots dug from frozen ground that others considered inedible. Grasses harvested at precise moments, dried and ground. Tree bark stripped thin, processed carefully, never spoken of aloud. Bones boiled not once, but repeatedly, until even the marrow surrendered its last trace of nourishment. Fat stretched beyond reason. Rios. Ed, re-rendered, transformed again and again. This was where the whispers began. Children talked, they always did. A careless word here, a curious glance there, and soon neighbors noticed things that did not align with expectations. Smoke from her chimney at odd hours. Children who did not appear as weak as they should. The absence of begging. People speculated quietly at first, then openly. "She's wasting what little she has," one woman said. "She's feeding them things that'll kill them," another warned. "Starvation makes people do foolish things," a man muttered, as if explaining a tragedy already decided. She heard none of it directly, but it reached her all the same. The frontier had a way of carrying judgment on the wind. She did not respond. She did not defend herself. She continued. The most radical part of the trick, the part no one would ever admit even when survival proved her right, was restraint. She refused to let the children eat until they were full, not once. Fullness, she believed, was dangerous. It encouraged waste, dulled the body's ability to adapt, and created expectations she could not sustain. Instead, she fed them to function, to think, to move, to endure. Hunger never vanished, but it became controlled, almost companionable. The body, she had learned, could adapt to less if less was consistent. It was the swings, from feast to famine, that killed people fastest. She also separated nourishment from pleasure. Meals were not entertainment, they were fuel. Stories were told after eating, not during. Warmth was offered freely, food was not. This distinction mattered more than anyone understood. It preserved morale without exhausting resources. Some nights, after the children slept, doubt crept in despite her resolve. She asked herself questions she could never voice aloud. Was she stealing from their future by denying them now? Was survival at this cost worth it? But each morning, when all 12 rose and moved and breathed, the answers quieted. Others were not so fortunate. As winter deepened, sickness spread through neighboring cabins. Bodies weakened by erratic eating gave in quickly. Fevers burned unchecked. Children died quietly in the night, too weak to cry. Funerals became brief, efficient affairs. No one had the strength for grief that lingered, and still the whispers continued. Some accused her of hoarding, others of cruelty. A few suggested she had struck a bargain of some kind, superstition rising where logic failed. The frontier had always been fertile ground for rumor. People needed explanations that did not force them to question their own choices. One neighbor finally confronted her, voice shaking more with hunger than anger. "What are you feeding them?" she demanded, eyes flicking toward the children clustered near the fire. The mother met her gaze calmly. "Enough," she said. It was the truth, and it ended the conversation. The trick was not magic. It did not create food where none existed. It extracted every possible ounce of value from what others ignored, wasted, or dismissed. It demanded patience, knowledge, and an emotional detachment most people could not tolerate when their children were involved. That was why it worked. As weeks turned into months, the difference became undeniable. Her children did not thrive. They survived. And survival in that winter was everything. They learned to move slowly, to conserve energy, to listen to their bodies. They learned that hunger was not an enemy to panic over, but a signal to manage. The mother watched them constantly, adjusting without hesitation when signs of danger appeared. She pulled back when needed, pushed when possible. There was no room for pride. Pride killed people. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, something extraordinary had happened. While other households counted their losses, hers counted breaths. 12 children still slept beneath her roof. 12 sets of footprints still marked the snow outside the cabin. The trick remained unnamed, uncelebrated, and largely unseen. That was how she wanted it. Because on the frontier, the moment ingenuity became spectacle, it invited interference, judgment, and failure. She did not need recognition. She needed survival. And against every expectation she had achieved it, not by doing more, but by doing differently. By the heart of the winter, survival was no longer an abstract goal but a daily operation that required precision. The trick alone was not enough. It had to be executed with consistency so relentless it bordered on ritual. Every day followed a rhythm she controlled completely. The children learned it quickly, not because they were told to, but because deviation carried consequences their bodies could not afford. Mornings began before the sun, not with food, but with warmth. She believed fiercely that heat preserved strength better than early meals. The fire was coaxed back to life using the smallest possible amount of fuel. The children gathered close, hands extended, bodies still heavy with sleep. Only once their stiffness eased did the day truly begin. Movement came before eating. Slow, deliberate tasks that woke muscles without draining them. Folding bedding, fetching water, checking traps set close to home. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Food came later, and when it did, it came measured. The meals were simple to the point of severity, but they were never random. She had learned that randomness bred anxiety, and anxiety burnt energy faster than cold. Each portion was calculated not just by size, but by purpose. Some days required strength, others required endurance. She adjusted accordingly, always thinking several days ahead. Hunger was managed like weather, unpredictable but survivable if respected. She transformed the act of cooking into a form of extraction. Nothing went into the pot without a plan for what would come out. Bones were boiled until the water turned cloudy, then boiled again days later, and sometimes again after that. Each time, something more surrendered itself. Fat was skimmed carefully and stored in small containers, used sparingly to stretch calories where they mattered most. Even the water from cooking was never discarded. It became the base for the next meal, carrying with it whatever nutrition had been coaxed free. The children noticed, even if they could not name it, that their meals changed texture more than flavor. Some days were thicker, heavier, designed to sit in the stomach and quiet hunger for hours. Other days were thin, meant only to take the edge off. She never explained why. Explanation invited argument, and argument wasted strength. She taught them to chew slowly, not through instruction but example. She ate last, always, not as a gesture of sacrifice, but as insurance. If a portion had to be reduced at the final moment, it would be hers. The children absorbed this without comment. Frontier children understood hierarchies of necessity better than most adults. Outside the cabin, winter tightened its grip. Snow piled high enough to bury fences. Wind scoured the land, stripping it of sound. Hunting became unreliable. Traps came back empty more often than not. When something was caught, a rabbit, a bird, it was treated not as a meal but as a resource to be dismantled and distributed across days. Fresh meat was a rarity. Its true value lay in what it could become later. She dried what little could be dried, smoked what could be preserved, and rendered everything else down into forms that could be hidden from time. The smell inside the cabin was not unpleasant, but it was constant, a blend of smoke, broth, and something harder to describe. It was the smell of effort. The children adapted in ways that surprised even her. They stopped asking questions that had no answers. They learned to recognize one another's limits. The older ones watched the younger closely, offering warmth, helping them rest when fatigue showed. In scarcity, the family became quieter, more efficient, bound together by unspoken rules. Illness hovered constantly, threatening to undo everything. A cough could turn deadly. A fever could drain strength beyond recovery. She treated sickness with the same discipline as hunger. Rest first, warmth always, nourishment adjusted carefully. She did not believe in wasting food on bodies that could not process it. That belief saved lives even when it looked cruel to outsiders, and outsiders did look. Neighbors noticed that her children still walked with purpose, that they did not collapse into snowdrifts or cling weakly to door frames. They were thin, dangerously so, but alive in a way others were not. This unsettled people. Survival that contradicted expectation always did. Some tried to imitate what they thought she was doing, but they missed the core of it. They added strange foods without discipline. They rationed without consistency. They copied pieces without understanding the whole. Their children suffered for it. She felt no triumph watching this, only a grim confirmation of what she already knew. Methods divorced from mindset were useless. Inside the cabin, morale was maintained with intention. She told stories at night, not to distract from hunger, but to anchor the children to time. Stories had beginnings, middles, and ends. They reminded them that things could move forward, that endurance was not endless, but purposeful. She never promised that spring would fix everything. Promises were dangerous. Instead, she spoke of tomorrow, of the next meal, of the next task. Survival was broken down into pieces small enough to hold. As the weeks dragged on, winter did what it always did. It tested patience. Supplies dwindled further. Mistakes became more costly. There were days when she miscalculated, when portions were too small and exhaustion set in early. Those nights were the hardest. She watched the children sleep, listening for shallow breaths, counting rises and falls, correcting course the next day without apology. There was no room for guilt. Guilt paralyzed. She had learned that quickly. By late winter, the family existed in a state outsiders would have called unbearable. And yet, they endured. The children learned to find comfort in routine, in predictability, in one another. Hunger was present, but it no longer dominated every thought. That, more than anything, preserved their strength. When storms raged outside and the world shrank to the walls of the cabin, she reminded herself why she had chosen this path. Not to make life easier, but to make it possible. Not to win admiration, but to avoid graves. The frontier did not reward effort with fairness. It rewarded adaptation with survival. And day after day, meal after measured meal, she proved that survival was not about having enough, but about knowing exactly how to use what little remained. When the first signs of thaw finally appeared, they were so subtle that only someone watching relentlessly would notice. The snow did not vanish all at once. It softened. The wind lost some of its cruelty. Water began to whisper beneath ice rather than lie silent. To most people it still felt like winter refusing to let go. To her, it felt like permission to breathe again, carefully, cautiously, without celebration. She did not mark the end of winter with a feast. There was nothing to feast on, and even if there had been, she would not have risked it. Survival had taught her that endings were fragile things. Instead, she allowed herself one small acknowledgement. She loosened the routine by a fraction. Portions grew slightly less rigid. Warmth replaced strict stillness in the mornings. The children noticed before she said anything. Their bodies noticed first. All 12 were alive. That fact settled over her not as triumph, but as weight. Survival had carried a cost, and she could see it etched into their frames. They were thinner than children should be. Their clothes hung loose. Their movements were careful, economical, shaped by months of restraint. Yet they moved. They spoke. They laughed softly. Life had not left them. Around them the settlement bore scars that would never fully fade. Some cabins remained empty, snow melting through broken roofs, doors swinging uselessly in the breeze. Graves stored out of the frozen ground, markers leaning as if tired of standing. Families counted losses instead of survivors. The sound of mourning carried farther than any celebration ever could. People began to talk openly now, not in whispers fueled by fear, but in voices shaped by grief and disbelief. How had her children lived when others had not? What had she done differently? Why had the same winter that killed so many spared her household? She did not offer explanations, not because she was cruel, but because she understood something most did not want to hear. Survival could not be handed over in neat instructions. What she had done required not only knowledge, but a willingness to endure judgment, to embrace discomfort without flinching, and to deny instincts that felt merciful but proved deadly. People wanted answers that did not implicate their own choices. She had none to give them. Spring came slowly, and when it did, it arrived damaged. The land did not recover immediately. Soil washed thin by years of abuse struggled to accept seed. Tools had worn down. Seed stores were pitiful. Livestock numbers were dangerously low. Survival through winter had not restored what was lost. It had merely preserved what remained. The frontier had not forgiven anyone. But the family approached spring differently now. EY did not plant with optimism. They planted with caution. They diversified where they could, spread risk across small plots, instead of trusting everything to one crop. She insisted on this, even when others mocked it as indecision. The children helped, moving slowly but steadily, their bodies still rebuilding strength. They had changed. Hunger had aged them in ways no one spoke of openly. The older children carried themselves with an awareness far beyond their years. They noticed waste instinctively. They understood restraint without being told. Even the youngest had learned that food was not something to be demanded, but respected. This was not something she celebrated, but it was something she accepted. Survival had shaped them permanently. As the seasons shifted and the immediate danger receded, the cost of what she had done began to surface in quieter ways. Some children struggled with appetite. unused to abundance when it slowly returned. Others ate too quickly, as if afraid food might disappear mid-meal. She watched these behaviors closely, adjusting again, guiding them gently back toward balance. Survival mode, she knew, was not something you simply turned off. Neighbors, meanwhile, rebuilt their understanding of the frontier. The winter had shattered illusions. Strength alone had not saved people. Faith alone had not saved people. Tradition alone had not saved people. What had saved some and destroyed others was adaptability. That realization unsettled many. It was easier to blame weather, fate, or misfortune than to accept that survival sometimes demanded choices that felt wrong until they proved right. Her family became a quiet reference point, not celebrated. Not resented openly, but watched. People noticed how her children recovered faster than expected, how they worked efficiently, without complaint, how they wasted nothing even when food slowly became more available. The trick had not ended with winter, it had rewired the household. Years later, when the land finally stabilized, when crops began to grow with something approaching reliability, the effects remained. The children carried those winters with them into adulthood. Some became cautious to a fault, stockpiling supplies even when necessary. Others became fiercely generous, sharing food instinctively, unable to forget what it meant to go without. All of them understood scarcity in their bones. It shaped their decisions, their values, their fears. And the mother, she never spoke of those winters as an achievement. When asked, she deflected. She said they were lucky. She said the children were strong. She said many things that avoided the truth that made people uncomfortable. Because the truth was this: survival was not heroic. It was relentless. It demanded a willingness to endure misunderstanding, to be thought cruel, foolish, or heartless when the alternative was death. What she had done changed the family forever, not because it saved them, but because it taught them something few ever learned willingly: that comfort is fragile, abundance is temporary, and survival depends less on what you have than on how you think. The frontier eventually moved on. Rail lines arrived. Towns grew. Stories of early hardships softened into legends told by people who had not lived them. The brutal winters became anecdotes, stripped of their terror and weight. But within that family, Mori remained sharp. Food was never wasted. Meals were planned. Children were taught not to fear hunger, but to respect it. Preparation became habit. Excess was viewed with suspicion, not out of joylessness, but wisdom earned at a cost too high to forget. Long after the mother was gone, her trick lived on, not as a method, but as a mindset. Her children passed it to theirs, not by describing boiling pots or strict portions, but by teaching restraint, awareness, and adaptability. They taught that survival was not about fighting the land, but understanding it, not about conquering hardship, but cooperating with reality. And when future generations faced their own crises, different in shape, but familiar in threat, they carried something others did not: the knowledge that impossible situations did not require miracles. They required clarity, discipline, and the courage to abandon comfort before comfort abandoned you. The frontier never acknowledged her. There were no records, no monuments, no stories carved into history books. Just 12 lives that continued forward when logic said they should not have. That was enough. Because in the end, the winters did not define her by what they took, but by what they failed to take.